and welcome to our webinar, Catechesis, Accompaniment, and Communion with the Person of Christ. I'm Colleen Campbell, Coordinator of Formation Programs at the Catholic Apostolate Center. I'm pleased to welcome my fellow presenters, Dr. Susan Timoney, Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America, and Stephen Serafin, Center Collaborator and Associate Director for Catechesis in Catholic Schools in the Archdiocese of Newark. We're pleased to have them speaking with us about accompaniment as part of the Center's webinar series on the Directory for Catechesis. If you have any technical issues today during the presentation, please send a message in the chat box on the bottom right corner of the screen, and a staff member will assist you. We will begin our conversation today with Pope Francis's prayer to the Blessed Virgin Mary, Star of the New Evangelization. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Star of the New Evangelization, help us to bear radiant witness to communion, service, ardent and generous faith, justice, and love of the poor, that the joy of the gospel may reach to the ends of the earth, illuminating even the fringes of our world. Mother of the living gospel, wellspring of happiness for God's little ones, pray for us. Amen. Alleluia. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Hi, everybody. It is a delight to be with you today. And here's a fun fact to get us started. Both Colleen and Stephen are doctoral students of mine. So Colleen in the PhD program and Stephen in the Doctorate in Ministry program. And I think this is really important for this conversation, because accompaniment really is an opportunity for us to deepen our understanding and our commitment to evangelization, and a kind of evangelization that perhaps best suits ministry in the 21st century. But to do that, we need to be able to look at it both in terms of its theological foundation, in terms of the way in which it's being studied in the academy, but also the practical application. And so that I hope that today's conversation really is an opportunity for us to be able to see the integration of theology and praxis as we look at accompaniment. And so to get us started, Colleen, I'd like you to kind of set the context for us and give us a good working definition of accompaniment and kind of the scope that we're going to try to break open for people today.
Sure. So when we talk about accompaniment, we are referring to this concept that Pope Francis talks about in his apostolic exhortation from 2013, Evangelii Gaudium. And in paragraph 169 is one of my favorite definitions of accompaniment. He talks about it as an art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. So it's just this really beautiful description of what accompaniment should be, which just essentially is this idea of intentional human relationships that we enter into in order to grow in relationship with God. And if you are ever interested in learning more about accompaniment in general, we at the Catholic Apostolate Center have an excellent resource that I have actually worked on as well. It's called the Art of Accompaniment, and it's available on our website as well as a print copy. But that's kind of accompaniment more generally. But today we're going to really talk about accompaniment in the context of the Directory for Catechesis, which of course is a very exciting day for all of us in Catechesis and Evangelization in July when it was published. I know it was a long-awaited document, but really the connection between accompaniment when Pope Francis talks about it in Evangelii Gaudium and the Directory for Catechesis is that when you open the Directory for Catechesis and you look at the introduction, it talks about all of these different developments that have happened since the publication of the General Directory for Catechesis, which was sometime before this one, the Directory for Catechesis. And so really what the Directory for Catechesis is trying to accomplish here is basically to integrate and reflect all of the developments that have happened in catechesis kind of in the last couple of decades. So one of those majorly being Evangelii Gaudium. So really when we're talking about accompaniment in the Directory, we're talking about sort of a direct application and translation of Pope Francis's idea of accompaniment to catechesis. So that's really where we see this connection between the two. So really, really important there. And I know something that I was like just very interested to see was how the directory dealt with accompaniment, because I know that I was interested in, is it going to talk about as a method of catechesis, like human experience, or just other methods that the directory has mentioned in the past. But accompaniment really appears in the directory for catechesis as an inherent natural part of catechesis, which I think is really, really important and really awesome to think about. So again, that's just kind of like where we are in this discussion of accompaniment. So I guess like that kind of brings us now to Stephen, when we think about accompaniment and catechesis, what does accompaniment have to do with the goal and the objective of catechesis?
Yes, perfect. Right. So what is the objective, right? Going back to Catechesi Tradendae, where we talk about we're called to put people in an intimate relationship with Christ, right? And that doesn't just happen over 1 year of someone being in religious education, right? Or in the course of like an RCIA program. It's actually a gradual thing that happens over the course of a person's life. And so where accompany is so important is that it's showing us that when we're handing on the faith, right? What is catechesis? It's echoing the word of God. It's something that we're gradually walking with people throughout the life cycle, as someone's trying to grow in a deeper understanding of their faith and truly understand the person behind the faith that we all believe. It's giving them a bigger picture of that and unpacking the mystery of that throughout the life. So throughout the life cycle. So that's one of the things I really love about the directory, where it says that that grade level model that we had of teaching and handing on the faith, it's effective, like where there's a way to organize, but at the times it might not be as effective in faith formation and faith development, because depending on your age doesn't mean where you have made that initial encounter with that person of Christ. And it's really acknowledging that we have to walk people to those encounters and then beyond those encounters.
I think to my mind, it really is interesting that they're trying to put the emphasis on being able to know the person who has come to you or whose presence you're in, and to figure out where they are in their walk before we decide what is the next piece of formation that might work for them. And so really this emphasis right on formation rather than education, I think, or formation being an important dimension of education.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a big role that plays into that is at times when we think of formation, I feel like we can very easily just think of the intellectual of like knowing about Jesus, knowing about your 10 commandments, knowing about the different aspects of how we're supposed to live the faith. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about formation, we're talking about the whole person. Mm-hmm. So you have the importance of the intellectual side, but then you also have the spiritual side, so the retreat, the aspects to catechesis. But then as important are the pastoral and human sides of formation. So really echoing that word into the individual's everyday life in the practical moments, especially in those high moments where you have those moments of celebration and those celebrations of loss. How are we integrating catechesis into those moments? I think are key, and really accompanying people through just the everyday of their life. And then when it comes to pastoral formation, I think at times we can definitely wait until like pastoral issues come up, and that's when we engage in pastoral formation. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? We're called to engage in all four of those areas throughout as we hand on catechesis to the faithful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephen and Dr. Timoney, both of your points kind of just reminded me of this quote that I really wanted to mention from the directory, which it comes from paragraph 55. It's describing the whole of catechesis. It says, catechesis is a dynamic and complex reality at the service of the Word of God. It is accompaniment, education, and formation in the faith and for the faith. an introduction to the celebration of the mystery, illumination, and interpretation of human life and history. And so I think that like really speaks to this idea of accompaniment being just like so natural and so holistic, both to catechesis and to human, the human person individually. So I just think the directory has a beautiful treatment of accompaniment. And to just, again, as both of you are saying, this focus on the human person and the focus of the person in front of us. I think it always is helpful to think about what like just the value of accompaniment is in general. So just like taking a step back from catechesis for a second, but just, why does Pope Francis even talk about accompaniment as like such an important thing to do in our faith? I think we can think about the value of human relationships to answer that question. So like, I just know that I've read a couple of studies that, kind of speak to this idea of human beings being the social species, and we need each other. So I know that there's scientific, I've read a study that there was scientific evidence that we're healthier when we're in close relationship with other people, and our brains work better. And we actually when we participate in a two-person conversation, listening is less mentally taxing for the brain, which I think is really interesting. And children also learn better with interacting. They learn better when interacting with other people rather than just watching or observing. And so I think that really just speaks to this value of accompaniment and how much we need other people. And so I think it's just so important. And I'm just thrilled as someone who studies accompaniment, just the treatment that the directory gives accompaniment, that it's this really important inherent part of catechesis, because it's really an inherent part of who we are as human beings in this, as a social species, for sure. And
I think it really emphasizes to the different models of how we hand on our faith. And so we have those models where I heard it once explained, like, where you have rows and circles, and so in the classroom you might be teaching about something and giving that intellectual sort of understanding of our faith. But then as you start to break down into like a small group, you can be more relational, like you were saying, Colleen. But then it gets even more intimate when you get to that 2 to 3. Right, and that's the model that Christ followed, right? That he talked to the masses, he had his 12, and then he also pulled to the side Peter at times, right? Peter and James at times, and so I think it's definitely it's something that helps in growth, because what is that? Accompaniment is like that mentorship and apprenticeship, right? It's helping. There's one person who's the teacher who's leading the other person, but at the same time, the teacher and the mentor can learn from each other, and so it's very helpful when we talk about our faith and handing it on to others.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also helpful as we think about the continuing work of evangelization and the place of community, right? We know that we encounter a lot of Catholics who maybe are more comfortable, more committed to this idea of the Sunday obligation, right? And so making sure they get to Mass, but not necessarily either feeling their need or having had an experience of it being a gathering with the community. So certainly in this time of the pandemic, when we've not been able to gather, I would hope that it helps people begin to realize their need, Colleen, as you were saying earlier, for community and their need to build relationships. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about how catechesis maybe can set the tone for broader parish ministry, but I think this even building on people's experience of not having community, not being able to socialize in ways that we took for granted, may give us an opportunity, a doorway, right, to invite people to consider an expectation they might have, a desire they might have for communities of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It seems that this, especially just going through the pandemic, I really do think, Dr. Timoney, that you're right, that this is kind of like a kairos moment, that this is a moment where God calls us to notice the challenges, but also the opportunities here. That let's notice this human desire for connection. Let's actually investigate that and like think about that more, and how can we actually use that in the service of evangelization, and how can we rebuild our communities after we've been apart for so long. But yeah, definitely, I think that this is such an important moment and we can't let it escape.
Yeah,
definitely. And I think it definitely challenged us with the pandemic, right? It showed us how actively are we connected to our communities? Do we wait for them to come to us, or do we have a system that allows us to connect to them beyond our parish walls? And I think that's a big challenge in the directory. Is right. It reaches out that ministry can't fall on one person, right? It has to. Sometimes in a parish, people look at catechesis and they're like, oh, it's the DRE's responsibility. It's the faith formation director's responsibility. But that's not the case, right? The directory talks about that the whole community is responsible for being catechists to each other and building that community. And I think if we start to move in that direction, which I think a lot of parishes have during this pandemic, because it's what's necessary, right? That not one person could not reach out to all of the parishioners, especially when we got into the lockdown, right? You had teams of people coming together to call parishioners to connect. And so I think it's there's definitely a great opportunity here where we can look at the whole community as a group of catechists handing on the faith.
Stephen, one of the things that we had talked about when we were talking in the early planning stages was it really is that amplification of Pope Francis's focus on being missionary and on going forth, right? And so seeing catechetical ministry as part of this ability to go forth, to reach out, rather than sitting and waiting for people to come to us and sign up.
That's exactly it, yeah.
And I think too, I know as we're talking, we're talking about how crucial it is to have human connection, how important human connection and relationships are to evangelization. But I know one thing that's on my mind, and I know is always on people's minds when we talk about accompaniment, is how do we do accompaniment? What does it mean to do accompaniment? And so, Stephen and Dr. Timoney, I'm just wondering, both of you have held various pastoral roles in parishes or dioceses. And so I was just wondering if you have any initial thoughts, either guided by the directory or in general, just very practical, like how do we do accompaniment?
Yeah, I think in building off of what I said previously of the whole community being responsible, I think it has the directory has an awesome line about catechesis being lived mercy. So I think that's what makes the difference of, do we hand on, are we handing on just teaching about Jesus, or are we actually teaching about are we handing on teaching about Jesus, or are we actually handing on the person of Christ? And are we living out what we're actually teaching? And so that was the challenge I think a lot of us faced in the pandemic, was that each of us, we can have people come to our religious ed programs, we can have people come to our adult faith formation, but are we actually implementing those things that we're teaching them in those classes? And so I think that was the big thing that jumped out to me. And so I think rethinking this idea of like one size fits all programs, and start thinking about how are we approaching the person that we're each, and there's a lot of people, and this is why it's so important that the community gets involved. But just one very practical example. So as Dr. Timoney said, so she is my director for my dissertation, or my treatise for my DMin project. And I actually just executed that, started that this past weekend. And I'm trying to develop a program for newly married couples. So right after marriage, in my research and what I've found is that there's very little that we do as a church. Normally across all these different events, like sacraments or events, we journey with people to that event, but then post that event, sort of that accompaniment falls short. And that goes back to what I said in the beginning, that idea of we need to also accompany people through the pastoral and teach catechesis through the pastoral and human sides of formation. And so what I'm doing is I'm inviting couples to come back, and it's all virtual right now, But I've been blown away by this experience because I sent out 2 emails to couples who've been married over the last 5 years at one particular parish, and I got 16 couples immediately to sign up for this program. Half of those couples have not been back into a church since they've been married. About a quarter of those couples have been are probably like semi-active, and then you have another quarter who are pretty active still in their faith. But the majority of them, even the ones who are semi-active, really haven't been active since COVID because of things going virtual. So this was like a first time where it gave me another point of contact to them, and what my goal is to teach is using like a skill-based program where we talk about communication, intimacy, prayer, reflection as a couple, and walk them through those skills as a way to be another welcoming, sort of a welcome back point for them to parish life, and to show them that the parish is here to walk with them throughout their marriages. And I just think it's stuff like that we need to start implementing, that becomes more of how do you live out our faith than just what is our faith, if that makes sense.
I think, I mean, what I hear in listening to Stephen is both experiential and formational. And so in this case, right, helping to form married couples to practice what we might call peer ministry, right, in a more formal context. Here, what we're saying is that they're going to be accompanying these other couples with whom they make relationships. And so I think we can broaden that out and think about what's so important is helping all the disciples, right? All of us recognize that we're called to accompany. So how do you form this interior attitude, or this sense of recognizing that part of my responsibility as a disciple is to accompany? And we know that what disciples do is they share their experience of Jesus. So I would love to see opportunities, parishes taking opportunities to be able to help people share their stories of faith, share where they've been touched by the love of the Lord, and how it's changed them, and to do that in perhaps formal ways, right? We need catechists to be able to do that as they're teaching and passing on the faith, but we know we need parents to be able to do it, and we need friends to understand, right, what it is in this person, what is it that they have that they might be looking for. So I would love to see us give more space and more opportunity for lay people to be able to give those testimonies, to build them in to part of regular parish experiences and programming, maybe into when ministries come together for prayer. Do they come together to do some faith sharing? Because in some ways, many of us would say, well, I accompany people, and not necessarily use that language. But it needs to become more intentional, I think. To me, this could really enable us to form our parishioners as missionary disciples, and for people to become comfortable thinking about themselves in that way. So that's one avenue I see that I think is so important.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that I think is really like we have to, like, as parish leaders or people who are leaders in the parish, we have to walk with even our best ministers and our best catechists are in understanding how to unpack that story. Mm-hmm. What I found, so before I was working for the Archdiocese, I was a pastoral associate in a parish, and what I found is I pulled all of my ministry leaders together, and the first session I walked them through is just, what is your faith story? Like, how have you encountered Christ? How has that impacted you? And what blew me away was that so many of them struggled and wrestled with how to vocalize that. They came to Mass every week, and they would participate in all sorts of things. They're on pastoral councils, finance councils, all these things, but to vocalize what God has done for them. And so giving them an opportunity to start to unpack that and hear other people's stories, it begins to open up their own experiences more. And that's the foundation of catechesis, right? We're echoing a living word, like an incarnate word, and to teach people how have they encountered Christ, and that's what they're handing on. And so I always try to tell people, like, some people say, like, oh, I can't teach the faith, or I can't talk about the faith. And if you can talk about what God did to you, you are doing that, right? You are handing on your faith, because you're echoing that word and how it's moved you and led you to a conversion that brought you closer to God.
Yeah, and I think that's just something that is a great tie-in, just something I'm hearing both you, Stephen, and Dr. Timoney talk about is just the importance of experience and basically telling the stories of our lives. And so I know that that's something that I've always been so taken by in all of the directories for catechesis, is this idea of human experience is an important way which we come to know about the faith. I know the general directory for catechesis, so the one before the directory for catechesis, talked about human experience as a locus for the manifestation and realization of salvation. So basically meaning that through our daily life, we can come to know and have a deeply held relationship with Jesus Christ. And that the Paschal mystery unfolds in our life. And so I think even just taking accompaniment even down a level from how do we form within the parish people to accompany, and how do we start doing accompaniment in a parish, but even how do we do accompaniment in our daily life? We ask those questions of, what is God doing in your life? I think my favorite question, kind of to spur a moment of accompaniment, if you will, is where is God in that? If someone comes to you and they tell you the story of something that's happened to them or something that they're going through, just kind of making space for them to be able to name, where they think God is, or, how they think God is showing up in this situation, I think is so key and important to just doing accompaniment in daily life. And Dr. Timoney, I think you had a great point too about how I know, especially as someone who's doing a PhD, I get very caught up in these very complicated definitions and these very theoretical things. But in truth, accompaniment is something that so many of us are already doing, and we just don't call it that. But I think that's such a key thing to name.
And here's where I think as we look for graces and things we've learned in living through the pandemic and in seeing the presence of God in this period of the pandemic, is that most of us have people in our circle for whom we've been concerned, either friends that might live alone, or in my case, my mom, who lives in a retirement community, and we've not been able to visit her. And so we've become really good at intentionally reaching out. Is it, sending more mail in the course of the week, or is it picking up the phone and calling? And so in a way, I think we've got the ability now to say to people, you've done that. And now what we're asking you to do is to weave into it where you see this presence of God, where you see yourself, because you're committed to wanting to imitate Jesus's love and mercy, to be able to articulate that piece of the why and the way in which you are sustaining friendships, or sustaining a sense of community, or thinking about your neighbor who might not be able to get out to the grocery store and willing to go do that. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to both show people that even not knowing the language, it is something that they practice. But sometimes I love to call Catholics the secret service of evangelization, because honest to God, we are not so good always at talking about it, right? Or visibly presenting ourselves as disciples who are excited about what we know of the Lord and want to share that. And so to me, we have this opportunity both in the vision of the directory and in the experience that many of us have had at the hard work of sustaining relationships in these times of social distancing, to marry the two in a way to say, and this is what we could be as a community moving forward. This could become part of the way that we understand what it means to be members of a community of faith.
And I think you said something that really I always love talking about, where it's being able to hand on the why of, right? Like I think that's key to remember, is that when sometimes, as you said, Colleen, right, we can get lost in the heady language and the things that we're being taught to hand that on to people. But what we're really talking about when we talk about catechesis and evangelization, it's the why behind the reason you're doing what you're doing, right? Like, why are you going to Mass every Sunday, right? Why is your faith passionate to you? And the more you can unpack that why, I think is how or help people feel comfortable explaining their whys, I do think the community becomes more alivened, because you see that purpose, you see the reason behind the actions of why that community is doing what they're doing. And so when it comes to catechesis, I always used to tell my catechists what I need you to answer first is, like, why do you want to do this? Besides that, you asked me to do this, but like, what's the reason that drove you to want to hand on the faith? And then that's where we can begin to really unpack that story, and that story continues, right? That even someone who's teaching the faith is still growing in their faith, and so that why is ever developing. So the more you can unpack that why, it's key.
Yeah, and Stephen, I think you hit on something really key there too, that is so important about accompaniment, and interesting when you put it in the context of catechesis, is that something that I know just in reading and looking through all of the different ways in which Pope Francis has talked about accompaniment, whether it's Evangelii Gaudium, whether it's Christus Vivit or Amoris Laetitia, he always talks about this sense of growth and gradualness. And so I think that's so interesting in catechesis too, is that I think we're so accustomed in the church, at least right now, when we think about intellectual kind of formation, that's kind of where we've been slanted in catechesis lately. And so I think that kind of that gradualness and that growth that accompaniment brings to catechesis is going to be very key, because, a focus on intellectual formation is a focus on content mastery, is a focus on being able to memorize and spit out. But I think where accompaniment very much helps kind of make a contribution to a sense of formation in catechesis is this recognition that the person in front of them, or the person in front of you as a catechist, is this person who's unfolding, who's dynamic, who's becoming, and is the person in front of you today is not necessarily the person in front of you tomorrow or the next day. And so I think accompaniment really brings to catechesis this very lifelong, dynamic sense to the formation that really catechesis always has, and that's always been present in the catechetical tradition. But I think accompaniment really makes a contribution in that way.
Yeah, it definitely does. And that's why I think when my project is addressing one hole, I think, in the life cycle that doesn't, that's not being met. But I think really parish teams need to sit down and look at and I think this is a big challenge, right? Because we get stuck in like, this is how we've done it, right? And like, this is like the model in which we've used the scholastic model or the school model for religious education for a very, very long time. And to be able to take a step back and say, okay, like how can we tweak this, or how can we make this better? And I think the pandemic has opened that door a lot, because it's forced us to sort of, I know in Newark, we've sort of been virtual this whole time. And so we've really been zooming into people's homes. And so be able to reach out to them directly in their homes. But to really challenge ourselves and say, like, am I actually accompanying people throughout that life journey, throughout that gradual process? Or am I accompanying them through the end of a year? Or am I accompanying them to a sacrament? And is there anything, what can I be doing to continue that accompaniment beyond that? And I think as a church, that's something we really need to look at and take a hard look at ourselves and say, hey, how are we accompanying people throughout this journey? Not just to check off, okay, these people have become confirmed. Like, and even in that confirmation, this is one of the things I challenge our DREs as well, is that, so is it requirements for confirmation? You have to do this and this, or you have to do some service hours. But even those service hours, where is that leading to? Is there a reflection that they're doing because of those service hours that's helping them sort of understand why they are doing those service hours? Or is it just a number that they're checking off to meet to get confirmed, right? Because that reflection is leading them closer into that person of Christ, and then will help beyond just their confirmation. So
I think I've said this before in other contexts too, that it really is asking us to think about moving away from being concerned about programs and being very structured programmatically, and building in time for experience and time for the building of community. And so the real challenge is, in some cases, less may be more, right? So less concern in a sense for the breadth of content, but to think more about how do we weave that content into experiences that we can share, not just with children, but with adults as well. And so I hope that it breaks open for us, not so much of thinking about what ministry programs do we have, but what experiences are we inviting people to? And to your point, Stephen, how are we inviting people to reflect on those experiences? To me, this is one of the great opportunities that we have to make a real shift in the way that we think about pastoral ministry and pastoral outreach.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that really hits on like sort of like how are we called to accompany, or how do we form people in accompaniment? And I think that's what is so crucial. And I think we've already hit on a very important thing with that formation, is to help people realize that they're already accompanying people. They might have accompanied somebody through the pandemic, like we talked about, right? Or they could be working with even their children, like they might be accompanying their children. So it's helping them first understand where they're already accompanying people in their lives, and then try to connect that back to the faith, and how once they understand their story, how they can share that. So Colleen, how would you say would be, and like what does directory say about ways in which we're supposed to teach people how to accompany?
Yeah, well, like this is one of my favorite parts of the new directory. I mean, there's just so much to love. I think the whole thing is my favorite part, honestly. But just the section on catechist formation I just find just beautiful. There's so many beautiful theological just implications of the way that the catechist is named. But I think especially just in talking about formation, accompaniment just like really shines in this section. But this just comes from, this is one of my favorite parts from the catechist formation section. This is from paragraph 135C. The church feels the duty of forming its catechists in the art of personal accompaniment, both by proposing to them the experience of being accompanied in order to grow into discipleship, and by enabling them and sending them to accompany their brothers. And so we see this like very, I think, continuous theme, even when we see Pope Francis talk about accompaniment, is this kind of foundational experience of being accompanied is always the best formation for preparing someone to accompany. He says this in Evangelii Gaudium. He definitely says this in Christus Vivit. But it's just this sense of you have first been accompanied, and so you know what that is supposed to look like. I know, many of us could probably point to places in our life where we've been accompanied for the better and maybe sometimes for the worse. But both of those kinds of experiences help us to be prepared to accompany and walk with somebody else. But two, I know I don't want to turn this into Colleen's favorite quotes from the directory, but I think just one of the other most beautiful quotes in this section is about the very particular skills that it takes to form catechists in accompaniment. So talking about the art of accompaniment, this style calls for a humble willingness to allow oneself to be touched by the questions and confronted by the situations of life, with a gaze full of compassion, but also respectful of the other's freedom. The new development to which the catechist is called resides in the proximity, in the unconditional acceptance and the gratuitousness with which he makes himself available to walk beside others in order to listen to them and explain the scriptures, without establishing the route in advance, without demanding to see the fruits, and without holding anything back for himself. And that's from paragraph 135C. But I think that's just such a gorgeous definition of what it looks like to accompany and what it looks like to be formed in order to accompany. It's just this sense of being able to be moved by the stories another person tells you, just being able to have compassion and empathy for them, but still at the same time being respectful of them and their journey, and above all respecting their freedom. And I think just those ending lines about accompanying someone without establishing the route in advance, without demanding to see the fruits, and without holding anything back for himself. So I think that just is kind of a really beautiful way to speak of accompaniment, of this selfless relationship. So the person who accompanies is not doing it to get something out for themselves. They're doing it for the purpose of being in relationship, so the person they're walking with can be in deeper relationship with God. So I think the directory has some great tips for us and great directions that it points us in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it points to, I know you guys quoted the Road to Emmaus in your book a lot, and then also the Samaritan woman at the well, right? And like those two times where Christ walked alongside an individual or two individuals, and what he does, right, is that he invokes a response from them by listening, by just being patient, by trying to understand their perspective, and so I think that's what Francis really does with this directory and in Evangelization, is where he's saying that we really need to be able to actively hear the person and be able to see where God is already at within that person, right? We can see the different aspects of where those encounters might have already happened, but that we have to help that person sort of unpack that. And so being able to use these models of Christ within the gospel, of how he drew out the responses from the people he was walking with and accompanying. I think that's what's key. And we can sometimes lose sight of that when there's, that's why I also like that quote that you read, Colleen, is because I think we can lose sight on that when there's like, oh, we got to get through this lesson, or we have to talk about this. And we can lose sight of those moments. I like to call them sort of like the burning bush moments, where it's like, oh, because I'm trying to get to my objective, I'm missing out on this moment where this person's wrestling and trying to develop an answer. And so that journeying with and like teaching them, like sort of provoking them with more questions, and then also teaching them how to pray and discern that this inner movement that they're experiencing, I think it's so crucial.
I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about parish-based accompaniment, and I think it's almost time to also open it up to questions. But Stephen, I wanted to shift it a little in case we have folks listening who work at the diocesan level, right? Because there you have a kind of shift in the relationship, and so sometimes folks who have responsibility at the diocesan level for catechesis don't necessarily have the one-on-one contact as much. And so how can diocesan ministers, diocesan leaders be supporting the this development of this experience of accompaniment? Yeah,
definitely. I think that's a crucial thing. And how I look at accompaniment is sort of like a trickle down effect of servant leadership, right? Like that we're the people at the top, so the cardinal or the archbishop or the bishop, they're there accompanying that next ring of people, and then like the directors and the co-directors, and then as myself as an associate director for Catechesis, it's my role to really walk with all of the DREs and people who are in charge of faith formation. And I think the only way we can do this well is we have to really answer the call to what Pope Francis also said in Evangelization, and he also mentions it in the directory, is this need for pastoral conversion. Our institutions have sort of been set in the model of the institution for a very long time. And I know when I was working in the parish, I can honestly say this, when I was working in the parish and the diocese would send something out, I would be like, oh, here's another thing from the diocese. I didn't feel like it was an accompaniment, more like here's an edict that I have to do something else, right? And so I know from my own perspective, when I switched over and I became working in the diocese, is that we're called to accompany and support the leaders of those parishes, and to walk with them and to feel and make them feel that they're going through that same experience. So we model that accompaniment for them, and then they model that accompaniment for their parishioners. And so it goes back to what Colleen was saying, this idea of we experience it and then we're able to hand it on to another, right? And so there's a beautiful line, I think it's 28 in the directory. It says, the church is she, it's a she, but so the church needs to listen unceasingly to what she must believe, to our reasons for hope, to our new commandments of love. She has a constant need to be evangelized if she wishes to retain her freshness. So I think as a church as a whole, we have to be open to the gospel and trying to experience our own encounters at a diocesan level and see where is God driving us and where are we being called to move. And I think that's the only way we're going to fruitfully and very vibrantly be able to keep supporting the local parishes. I think that's is the number one key is to really look at what you're doing and see how does this actually one-on-one accompany those at the local level at the parish.
Yeah, I think it really again puts that emphasis on this idea of building communities, and I think on the idea that we all share a responsibility, right, bishop, priest, and laity, in this commitment to accompanying and to creating space so accompaniment can happen. Thank you.
Definitely, and I really liked how the directory really lays out at each level the need for resources to be made available for this to happen. Right? I think that this does take energy. It takes time, money, and so to be able to at each level that this is so crucial and so important. And this is how missionary discipleship happens, right? You're walking with people outside of our wall. So it's the diocesan office getting out of the diocesan office and visiting parishes. It's parishes getting outside of the parish wall and visiting people in their homes. It's becoming a more missional church, not just waiting for people to show up to our events.
Well, I wanted to thank you guys. I think this is a good point to start the Q&A section. My name, for those, is John Sitko. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs. I've been helping in the background for some of the technical things, but I will be helping facilitate our Q&A for the next about 15 minutes or so. First question that came up through the chat is specifically geared towards Stephen, but I think all of you can answer this question pretty simply. For our parishes, how do we begin the process of doing something like you had talked about with your DMIN program, of that sort of online / reaching out elements of accompaniment when it comes to some of our ministries and programs?
Sure, definitely. I think first. Yeah, I think if we, the first important thing is to look at sort of that life cycle and see where are there spots that we're not able to that we're not fulfilling, right? Where there's times where that's normally happening is in the more practical times. So another thing. So I just had a newborn baby. She's 6 months now. You might have heard her a little bit. She was crying a little bit in the back. I was nervous that it was going to get a little loud. But that's another perfect moment of accompaniment. No one gives you a certificate to be a dad or a mom. They just said, "Here's a baby, and let's go." And so I think that's a very clear moment where we can invite people back to put them in community. And there's a desire, right? There's a desire for parents at those new parents to be walked with each other. But what we do normally is we wait, right? They get married, they might come back for that baptismal class, and then we don't see them again until they're ready for First Communion preparation. So it's so key to set up those little communities and put them in community with each other, and then having that point of contact at the parish. But this is why it's also important, right, that it's not just one or two people at a parish doing this, but everyone takes on a responsibility to do this. And so you might have a couple who's yearning for this community that you can help work with so they can start this up for you.
I also think it's a time that we can really play to the cultural diversity of many of our communities, either our parishes or the diocese as a whole, because I think in my experience of the African community, of the Latino community, Mass on Sunday is always accompanied, right, by a meal afterwards, or that commitment to want to stay and to socialize. And so I think in thinking about ways of making what has typically been called coffee and donuts, but something that is more focused on relation, right? Or working with that diversity that exists within some of our parishes to learn how we extend that out to to socialization being seen as important, right, as gathering for liturgy and as gathering for catechesis. And so I think in some communities that has remained part of the tradition. And so maybe coming together for conversation around that would be something that I would love to see more of our parishes do.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add is I thought very practically of like, how do you start this? And I guess just my inclination would be with just things in ministry that we want to start is just, who are your people that you can bounce this idea off of? Is there someone who accompanies you in ministry that you can kind of talk to about these gaps, like Stephen was saying, that we have in the life cycle, that we could be doing a better job at our parishes or communities or schools or anything? And, just kind of having a core group of people to kind of pilot something. And it could just be as informal as, it needs to be. You can just have a time of faith sharing, and it doesn't need to be a program. Because I think sometimes even programs can stifle accompaniment a little bit. But I think it's really just important to, identify those gaps and then identify those relationships that you have that maybe you can have some footing to get started and to kind of make something happen.
Yeah, and I think another good starting point too is to begin to train a small group of your key ministers, right? To do that, what we talked about throughout this whole webinar, but to really understand their faith story, and challenge them to actually start to share it with other members of the community, and then have some time to come back to you and sort of say, like, review how was that, like what did it feel like to share that, or I got shut down when I told it to this person, but this person really responded well to it. I think we need to be able to really teach people how to disciple other people. And so I think that's what's key is to really taking on that time at all the levels to just be present and take the time to teach someone how to hand that on.
Going back to something that Dr. Timoney had mentioned is the question of what does accompaniment look like in communities that are either intergenerational or multicultural? And the reason I specify those two groups is because a lot of times they take on our roles of accompaniment can take on different roles depending on the audience or depending on the circumstance. So I'm curious, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Timoney. What does this look like a role of active accompaniment when you're navigating sort of like multicultural issues or intergenerational considerations in a parish or a faith-sharing community?
This is a great question, and here I would look to Pope Francis's letter to young people, Christus Vivit. And one of the things he states in there is that young people are really interested in having mentors of all different generations. And where's the one place in most people's lives that you have multi-generational people together outside of perhaps a family gathering is a parish. And so parishes are already set up, right, in a way to be multi-generational for sure, and more so becoming multicultural as well. And so I think it's another moment of saying, rather than thinking we're going to have a Bible study for women and we're going to have a Bible study for men and we'll have a Bible study for young adults and ultimately someone's going to be left out, why not say maybe one option we would love to have is a Bible study for anybody in the parish who wants to come, and an opportunity, right, to bring people together, I think, to listen. That's such an important, when we think that someone is different than ourselves, when we think that our experiences don't have much in common, we have to first, as Stephen and Colleen were saying, we have to share stories. And in those stories, we have to see what we share in common, and then maybe what we can learn, right? What helps us to think differently. So what are the gathering spaces to bring multi-generational representatives from the communities within the communities together to say, how do we want to be community? How can we understand each other's stories of faith that may look different, but teach us something? So there, I would just love to see opportunities where we're intentional about inviting a wide spectrum of the parish. I was working with a pastor one time who had a really large Filipino community, and they wanted to have the traditional 9-day novena before Christmas. And he said, we'll start it in the parish if 3 years from now, this is a parish-wide novena, and it's not the novena that the Filipinos do. And I thought that that was great, that he put the responsibility on them to begin to think about inviting people to come, to think about how they could share with people what the novena is, why it's such an important part of their tradition, so that it grows beyond this one group of people into a parish-wide event. I would love to see that kind of intentionality practiced across the board in some ways.
Yeah. I think a clarifying thing too to say about the journeying with people across the life cycle is that it will almost be impossible to have a group for every sort of age range of the life cycle, because you'll think you have it all figured out, and then a person will come up and be like, there's nothing here for me. And so that's why intergenerational is so important, right? We do need to meet needs of people, especially in those big moments of transitions, like, right, so post-marriage, like even going into college, leaving college, post-marriage. Then you also have when the families start to have families, like after deaths. Like we need to have those moments of connection. But what really gets everyone and make sure everyone is a community is by intergenerational connect points that they can they feel connected to. But I do think we also have to do better at of fostering dialogue amongst these different generations, right? And because I think there's a lot of times that there can be a lot of misconceptions about generations, and that's every generation, right? The older generation thinks something about the younger generation, the younger generation thinks something about the older generation. So I think it's trying to get through that, weeding through that, and being able to realize that on both ends we can learn from each other. And by setting that up, I think that's how you really are accompanying along the life cycle, because there won't be a whole, like, people can find a home in your parish no matter what age they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, like, I'm thinking of this question kind of on a personal level, and I'm thinking of just as a young adult myself, the people who have accompanied me have taken me seriously, and they haven't just been like, oh, cute, this young person wants to get involved in the church, how sweet. No, they've really taken it seriously that, I have gifts and certain things that I'm interested in, and that those can be put in service to the church. And so I think when we go to, we want to accompany somebody who is different from us, it's just remembering that not to other them, not to put between us, that, oh, it's cute. It's like this little young person who wants to do something for the church, or it's this person who I'm going to accompany from the Hispanic or Latino community. But to remember, like, that cultural diversity and the intergenerational diversity is very important. And, but at the same time, we're all human beings. And so when we're accompanying someone, it's important that we don't kind of get wrapped up into othering somebody. And so I think that would be just something really important to remember, both on the intergenerational front and the cultural diversity front when we're thinking about accompaniment.
Yeah.
And since we're coming up relatively close to our time, I want to go with one last question that's sort of a big topic question, but I want you guys to dream up this a little bit. We haven't prepped this, so this will be interesting. And I'll start with Colleen first. For yourself, in your role, what does a successful parish formation program look like utilizing accompaniment?
So I think first, so this wouldn't be a measurable goal, so I don't know if this is cheating a little bit, but the measurable goal for me would be, or not measurable goal, but the goal would be mature adult faith. So accompanying someone to be able to be the protagonist in their faith life. So that it's not somebody who's engaging in a relationship of accompaniment just to be dragged along, but somebody who comes forth from this program, a protagonist in the church, in their community, in their field, in their job, in their family, but somebody who takes initiative and goes forth from this experience of accompaniment aware of their vocation as a missionary disciple and really equipped with a new, mature adult faith.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I would say that there is an inherent responsibility that is seen within the community that each person sort of takes on walking with somebody else, right? It could just be one other person, but like just that each person that is a part of that community says, you know what, hey, I'm responsible for checking in with this person, and so I think that is the goal, and that I think it's a culture that needs to be developed, but it's definitely something that I think would be a good metric.
And I'd have to say, I actually have had this dream, John, let's put it that way. Going beyond catechesis, where in a sense it's so clear to see the need for the formational piece and to weave that in, I would love to see our ministry groups, when they come together for a meeting, not say, okay, here's the agenda and here are the 3 things we have to plan, but to spend time in prayer together and to spend time faith sharing, either reflecting on what's happening within the ministry or taking some time as we're entering into a liturgical season to ask each other to talk about, well, what is this Lent going to look like in your own life? I would just love to see us use those times we naturally come together in a way that's much more nurturing of our faith, of our relationship with the Lord, and our relationship with one another.
I think that question is a good place for us to end on, because we've hit our time. A couple of housekeeping things before I wrap us up. If you like this particular webinar, and I first of all want to thank our 3 presenters here for an excellent presentation, but if you guys like this webinar, this is actually a webinar in a series on the Directory for Catechesis. This is actually our second in a series of 7 webinars. We actually have another one with one of our attendees actually is going to be our next presenter, Bridget, from the diocese, or from the University of St. Thomas. Will be giving a presentation on February 2nd. I've included that in the chat if you'd like to register. But if you go to catholicapostlescenter.org/webinars, all of the webinars will be there, including this one when it's uploaded as a YouTube video. A couple of other pieces. I would like to say that we'll have the recording of this webinar up on our YouTube channel the next week. So keep an eye out on our website, as I just specified. You are welcome to share this with anyone you like in your circles, because our content is always free to share to further the mission of the gospel. If you have not yet found us on social media, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, in the hope that we'll continue to reach more people with spreading the message of the gospel. And in the words of our patron saint, St. Vincent Pallotti, may the charity of Christ urge us on.